Welcome to Suits on Suits. This is our first episode, season 1, episode 1 of the show rewatch or first time watch show Suits. We're going to follow the arc of the show going episode by episode once a week. Hopefully kind of give some insight as we see it into the world of Suits, which is a very familiar world to both of us.
Yeah, so we're gonna give some preliminary takes, high level what we thought. We'll dive into some of the plot points, discuss, our takes on the plot, on the culture of law. Every once in a while, drop in a take on the law itself as it's portrayed on the show.
Not too often to annoy the folks who are listening, but yeah.
And we're going to try it out on this first one. And if people want some more law, we'll give it to you.
Yeah. Let us know in the comments so that we know what is most interesting to you and salient.
We'll quickly chat about the characters, kind of talk about how that comports with, our experiences at big law firms, maybe Jared's in particular, and then talk about the culture of law, kind of what stood out to us as one or two things that stood out as particularly accurate, things that maybe stood out as less accurate, and then we'll wrap up with a quick discussion on what we're looking forward to seeing in coming episodes. All right, so let's dive in. What were some of your thoughts, like high level, on the show?
Yeah, so I think kind of first, Harvey looms large. He's the guy that we're going to be watching the narrative arc of. I think a lot of the other characters, I mean, obviously you realize like Mike is an important counterpoint to that, counterbalance, but I think, he's the center stage, and it'll be interesting, they're trying to paint him in a very particular way in the first episode. They spend a lot of the episode showing that, and, he kind of looks like a superhero, a human, not like with some mutation or Marvel style, but like, think James Bond. And they really lean into the James Bond characteristic. But at the very end, they reference Batman, which I think is actually even, they didn't do that on accident.
Of course.
Yeah, because it's really like a human superhero meet, with a buddy comedy, or not buddy comedy, but like buddy bromance kind of relationship. So that's, for me, that's going to be really fun to see that narrative arc, and how they use the law to bring him up, and then also how, he may misuse the law to kind of take him down. And I think there's going to be a lot of peaks and troughs around that.
Totally. And I mean, Harvey can't lose so far.
Yes.
That's one of the things I'm curious to see play out. It's like, are they going to humanize him a little bit, or can Harvey just never lose?
Yeah.
The only other thing for me was, as we're being introduced to Harvey, we see him right out of the gate. He wins big. He's getting offers from other big law firms.
Yes.
We see that he's loyal. He's the type of person who turns down those offers, and really setting that Bruce Wayne
Totally
persona right out of the gate.
He's in a world of leverage and risk, and he is always one step ahead of the competitor, and has absolute loyalty to the people who brought him up. Those 2 points are going to be salient, I think, character development.
I think it's easier to poke holes in something. Yeah. There are parts of that really rung true to me.
Same.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought was interesting, so looked up to see who the original writer was.
Ooh, interesting. I didn't do this.
His experience was on Wall Street, ended up changing the show to be based at a law firm as opposed to like
an iBank
on Wall Street.
That's interesting to me, honestly, because one of the things that I think why a lot of lawyers like this show is because the lawyer is the focal point. In reality, the lawyer's in a lot of ways a very important player, but they're a service provider, right?
Yeah. And
so I could see how an iBanker who's making a deal, closing deals, potentially, obviously, in a lot of ways, they are service providers too. If they're kind of deal runners, or if they're representing, pre-IPO companies. But like, I could see how that perspective is kind of fun for a lawyer, that they get to be center stage, I can imagine. So that to me was an interesting dichotomy. He is the star of the show, even though in reality lawyers are kind of the service providers who are at the whim of their clients in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And I think oftentimes trusted advisors that are really integral to the deals, but they are ultimately service providers.
They're not the principal. They're the agent.
Not the principal. 100%. Well put. Speaking of making the decisions around deal making, being center stage versus being the agent of the principal, we start the show at a poker game that bleeds into this in-person merger.
Yeah.
So do you have any experience with in-person negotiations like this? I don't. I know that there are big M&As that happen in New York that are in person. There's a lot of activity, but I don't know anything that stood out to you about that.
Yeah.
That experience.
So I would say the interesting thing to me, a couple points popped out. One, in-person merger negotiations are increasingly rare, especially after COVID, where everything's kind of the work-life balance gets a lot better because you can do everything over Zoom. Probably outside of very large public-to-public M&A deals, most of it's not in person. There is live negotiating. It's rare that it's in person and you're kind of chaotic like that. Like if anything, like in the room when they go in and there's like a corner, there are two people negotiating here, two people negotiating here. What's actually happening, it's so boring. You are sitting in a room and you're going through the markup point by point, if it's live or if it's virtual, and you're going point by point, and you hit a corporate point, the corporate people are negotiating. You hit an intellectual property point, the intellectual property folks are negotiating. You hit an exec comp point, exec comp points on either side. So the law firm for the buyer, law firm for the seller. And you may have 20 people in the room like that or on Zoom like that, but they're going point by point. There's no chaos.
Yeah. Yeah. My only experience with in-person negotiations like that is working for the city of New York whenever we were doing affordable housing financing.
I remember that.
The closings would be in person.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's still the case or not, but just like a vestige of old rules.
Yeah.
You'd have wet signatures and in-person closings. Big developers that would typically be getting gap financing from the city of New York to incentivize them. So in exchange for that financing that's offered on preferential terms,
got it,
they have restrictive covenants where a certain percentage of the housing in their new development will go to people who earn, some percentage of the area median income.
Got it.
So to make housing affordable for people who aren't making a ton of money. Long story short, we didn't have the same action I saw in that room. There was a lot of sitting around and waiting, and then you'd strike through a point. Somebody would go, print off these 80 pages, and then you'd sign the edits.
But I think that is an interesting point that you're talking about with the wet signatures and printing off the edits and bringing law, depending on what area of law you're in, is in a various states of adopting modern technology.
Yeah,
like
totally.
That's a super interesting point. So like this is maybe a vestige of 20 years ago. People were actually negotiating in large rooms. I haven't really seen it in my career, and I've been practicing for 10 years.
Yeah.
And now it's much more about trading emails and trading documents over emails, which is better for the client because it's way more efficient and way more cost effective.
Totally.
But I remember some of the things whenever I started, it was very rare that people use DocuSign. Now everything's signed on DocuSign, but certain governmental contracts that we still deal with you have to have wet signatures, and you're telling me about that. Like it's a bizarre state of technological advance.
Some people might be familiar with this, but laws are, I would assume most people are watching the show are to some extent, but laws are different from state to state. But then there are like local rules, and there are common practices from one jurisdiction to the next, even within the same state, or maybe even within the same county or the same city, from one courtroom to the next. The state of tech and law is fascinating.
I think the funny thing though is, so they talk about bluffing throughout this episode. I feel like so many law movies and shows create or like express acumen in an unknowable world. A world full of speculation and
risk. You're playing the odds. You have to make the best decision based on partial information.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's a perfect metaphor.
Yeah.
And this is just a small criticism. They show him winning, but he has 2 aces at the beginning, which just doesn't have any risk. There's no bluffing. There's nothing. he gets lucky too. I think that's another piece of the show is, it's written, it's fictional. There's going to be some luck on his side.
Maybe pulling back the curtain a little too much, but I think a lot of the best lawyers lose a lot. And they don't, for all the obvious reasons, they don't advertise that. They don't promote those losses too much. But yeah, it is like poker in the sense that it's like you're playing with the cards you're dealt. They're just typically not double, you don't have pocket aces. But yeah, you're playing the odds. You're leveraging what you have to work with. And it's a great metaphor. And you see the people who play the odds strategically and who insert this human element that is bluffing when necessary, they win an outsized percentage of the time, even if that's 70% of the time.
Poker is a good metaphor for life and capitalistic business endeavors.
Yeah, so let's jump ahead. We get introduced to Mike.
Mike's a really likable guy, I gotta say.
Yeah, agreed. I don't know if this will make it into the show or not, but there is this element of everybody, even with their imperfections, their imperfections are even a little bit perfect.
Yeah, but fair.
Yeah, he's an underdog. Yeah. Love the underdog element to it, but he's down on his luck. He's doing what he's got to do to make a buck, but he's living in like a pretty well appointed, nice little apartment.
That's every New York, LA, San Francisco apartment is like a $6,000 apartment that they make seem like a less than $1,000 apartment.
Totally. It's like,
having lived in those cities, coming from Northeast Missouri, I am appalled whenever I see the like poor person living in an apartment that I could have never afforded whenever I was younger.
The summer I wasn't working for a law firm in New York, it's like I lived with 6 other people. Was like
that's very relatable to New Yorker.
Deep Bushwick, and was still paid like something like $1,500. It's like
exactly.
But yeah, so okay, we get introduced to Mike. I can't remember the first time we meet him, but pretty quickly thereafter, if not in the first scene, he's taking the LSAT for somebody else.
Right.
So I guess I'll put it to you. Any thoughts? I had a couple myself on this.
Yeah. I'm sure that we're going to overlap on this. Yeah. But one, and this is just like a kind of a legal eagle nerd point, but the LSAT is a curved test. So choosing, you could guarantee you were going to get a 180 if you got every question right.
Absolutely.
You could not guarantee any other point along the spectrum because it's all about it's all about landing within a percentile. So like, I don't know exactly what it is, but like,
so like you could get one additional question right and go from like a 172 to like a 174 potentially.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. And it just depends on how the rest of your test takers perform on the exam. And the reason they believe in the curve is that they think it normalizes how hard the test is or how easy it is. So anyway, that was one point. He says with absolute black and white confidence that he got him I think it was a 158. Yeah.
So we're introduced to Mike. He's taking the LSAT, and then we see this drug deal go wrong. We could talk about that a little bit, but I'm a sucker for the Sherlock Holmes aspect of him asking about whether where the pool is at and the pool being closed.
Yeah,
he noticed.
Am too.
Yeah, I don't care how realistic it is. It's fun, and I'm a sucker for it.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a great narrative trick, and you're right. It's totally Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah,
but it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
The only other plot point maybe is he's in an environment with friends who he can't trust.
Yeah.
And I think it builds, and he references it later in the episode. He doesn't trust anybody.
Yeah.
And with friends like these, why would you?
You kind of understand the lack of vulnerability between Harvey and Mike, even though he knows Harvey's kind of going to bat for him. And it makes me that much more excited for it to work out.
Yeah, because you see two guys who have soft spots, but have not shown them.
Yeah,
they're unwilling to share it with anybody else because they're afraid everyone else kind of burned them. We don't get Harvey's story yet.
Yeah,
hopefully we do. But Mike's is pretty clear why he has the shield up.
Okay, so he finds himself in the interview room.
Yep.
One thing that stood out to me was maybe the most common misconception about what leads to success in the law.
Yes.
It's definitely not memorizing facts.
It definitely is not
Like,
memorizing facts.
You have to understand concepts, and you need to know rules. Absolutely. They even reference, well, you're sitting behind the computer, and then he turns the computer around, he's playing cards. But if you can sit at a computer and quickly look it up, how valuable is that? It's like, it's nice to understand the framework. It's nice to understand how these different rules play together. But as far as memorizing facts, it's not really what it's about. It helps to pass the bar exam. It helps a little bit in law school. Even there, oftentimes, like, you'll have an outline for exams, depending on the professor. So it's like,
it's analyzing the law. It's
totally.
analyzing fact against a law, and a law that probably, because it's stare decisis, doesn't have an exact answer for your particular fact pattern.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, and such that you have to make analogous arguments to law that has already been decided.
Yeah, and stare decisis is just another phrase for precedent. So you're gonna base future decisions on past legal decisions.
Yeah, we are in a common law legal system in the United States, and that is how law is set and decided. Previous decisions by higher courts.
Yeah.
It's a little unrealistic that any law firm's only going to hire from one school.
Yeah.
But it is very real that law firms go to different schools and have tons of people waiting in line to go to 20 interviews in a day.
Yeah.
The law firm's going to have, I don't know, every 30 minutes they're going to have a new interviewer come in. Actually, whenever I was there, it was 20 minutes. And they're going to have a new student, and they may have 20, 30 students come in on a single day. And as a student, you spend a whole 5 days on campus interviews, interviewing with different law firms, like hundreds of them. Or not, there are hundreds of them there, but you're probably doing like 20 to 30 interviews in that week. But it is exhausting. I don't know about you, but by the end of that week, I was totally exhausted.
No, similar experience. They might only interview from a handful of schools, but it certainly wouldn't just be one. And then they run through, I think I did something like 25 interviews.
Same.
So they're not going to be in New York, but ours, like at Harvard, they actually were in a hotel room.
Same with mine at Berkeley. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to ask about that. So, it was at the Charles Hotel. For the week, law firms basically rented out the entire hotel. Yeah, it was a weird setup. You walk into a hotel room, run through the same interview, 20, 30 times in a week. The interviews that went well, you get a call back, and then you'd fly out or take the train down to New York for callback interviews, where it's like the second round after you've gotten through the on-campus interview, which is basically a screener interview. If you get the call back, I don't know if it's fair to say it's yours to lose, but something like, I don't know.
It's got to be north of 50% likelihood.
Definitely north of 50%.
That you're going to get an offer.
Yeah.
They're playing a number game. You're playing a number game.
Totally. And then speaking of, a firm that recruits only from Harvard, I don't think any of those firms exist. Maybe there's some like small boutique that tries to do that with like 5 lawyers, but practically speaking, this doesn't exist.
Oh, one other distinguishing feature. He was interviewing for a job to start. That is not how law firm interviews work.
Yeah.
They interview you after your first summer has ended. So like you go through your first year of law school, then you have a summer internship, and then they interview you before you go back to your second year of law school. And it's for an internship the following summer. So then you do your second year of law school, then you go into your internship with the law firm for the summer. It's like 10 weeks. And then you go back to your third year of law school, and then you take the bar, and then you join. So it is, let's call it 2 years in advance of when you'd actually, like north of 2 years from when you would actually start at the law firm.
Yeah, the timing's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So he needs an associate. He's not going.
Yeah.
He's not going to the school right now. He's probably hiring a lateral from another firm.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to talk about was Rachel gives Mike a tour of the firm. As she's doing it, she points out.
This is after he's been hired.
After he's been hired.
After he shows he's the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah,
after he shows that he memorizes everything, which again, to Quinn's point, not realistic. Yeah.
Yeah. So Mike's at the firm. Rachel's giving him a tour. They touch on the firm organization and the structure. I think they say I forget the details, but I think they said it's organized by like arenas of law or something like that, which isn't a phrase I've ever heard, but like areas of law or practice groups. There's like a litigation practice group versus corporate. It's maybe the biggest divide in law.
Yeah.
You've got a few divides, but it's corporate, which is doing like paperwork, the deal work, negotiating the deals, and then litigation, which is, you know, suing people essentially over disputes on those deals, maybe over, you know, common law claims or whatever.
Yep.
And then I guess one other divide worth mentioning is there's criminal and civil. So criminal being anything where there's a prosecutor, be that, you know, federal, state, or local prosecutors, and their criminal defense attorneys. And then civil is essentially everything else. It's disputes over things that will not result in jail time.
Yeah.
As they're talking about the firm organization, was there anything that stood out to you? And I guess if not, could you just speak to the way firms are structured a little bit?
The most salient thing, and first thing I'd bring up, is the paralegal being the keeper of the firm knowledge and the secrets is so realistic. That may be the most realistic thing that happens in this entire episode. She knows what's going on. She knows how the partners operate. She also has, she works with associates. She's helping Mike out at some point. But she's by far more knowledgeable than him. All of those things are so real.
Yeah.
In terms of how it's broken down, I think, to be honest, you kind of, how they structurally, physically break it down, you know, it tends to be people who work together, sit close together in these large law firms.
Another thing I think they mentioned was they operate on the chain of command model. I'm not sure exactly what they were referencing there, but I think it's like, I believe they said something like, you know, you report to Lewis Litt, who's head of like all juniors essentially, and you report to Harvey, who's like your direct boss. Can you talk a little bit about the way, in your experience, firms are organized in terms of like I know I've heard you talk about their kind of little fiefdoms, for example. And
Yeah, totally. So there are kind of two main ways that, so obviously there's practice groups, but then within those practice groups, which is really what you care about, how are you, like, who's your boss and who are you reporting to?
Well, let's take a step back. What are the job titles or?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. So taking a step back, there's partners who are owners of the law firm, have to be voted into the partnership, receive their compensation mostly based on how well the firm does on profits and losses, not like a set salary, again, for the most part.
Yeah.
And then there are associates who are salaried employees. They're associating with the partners is kind of the old school, like how the vernacular came to be.
Yeah.
They're practicing law as associated with the partner.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of, I think, is born out of the idea of an apprenticeship model. It's either kind of a free market system or a working for a specific partner or partners. The firm that I have always worked at, they have a free market system. So if you're in the practice area, you can work with any partner or any associate who's in that practice area, and your bosses are the partners in that practice area. At other firms, they have you're hired by similar to this, actually, very similar to this. You're hired by a specific partner, and that partner gives you all of your workflow. It gives you, the partner is in charge of your, like, if something happens and you need to be disciplined or like something like that, they're the ones doing it every time. They're in charge of you. They're in charge of the positives, feeding you with work and teaching you and mentoring you. And they're in charge of, like, if there's anything wrong, like making sure you're aware of it.
We get to this tour at Harvard Law School, and then later some comments by Lewis Litt where he's grilling Mike about his time at Harvard.
Yeah.
And he asks him some of these questions. One thing that popped out to me was Mike is saying, I think it was Lewis's cousin, Mitch, who he says went to
nephew or something like that.
Yeah, I think it was his cousin, who went to Harvard Law School same year as Mike, and he didn't know him.
Yep.
So like two things jumped out at me. One, Harvard Law School does have big class sizes.
Yeah, one of the largest law schools.
Yeah, it's something like 550.
Yeah.
And a lot of law schools hover around 200.
Yeah.
I guess a comment was, it seemed plausible that he wouldn't know him. In my experience, I didn't know everybody in my class.
Yep.
I was familiar with most people, friends with, so it's broken down by sections.
Yep.
Certainly knew everybody in my section, friends with tons of people in my section, plenty of people outside of my section. But the idea that you wouldn't know somebody, even in your year, absolutely plausible.
Yeah, it's not a red flag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a red flag. And then he says, oh, Mitch graduated 7th in his class.
Yeah.
Because I think there was a board behind some of the admin
that's right.
stuff
That's right.
with the top performing students. So Harvard Law School doesn't release class rank.
Yeah, same with Berkeley.
Yeah, they certainly wouldn't just have it like publicly.
Yeah.
But they don't release class rank. There are prizes, and so I think the highest GPA, which is kept private and calculated internally, students with, I think it's the 2 highest GPAs
At the
earn
end of
prizes
at graduation.
Yeah, it's after 1L. There's what at least was called the Sears Prize. It might still be called the Sears Prize, and then at graduation there's another prize for highest GPA, but you wouldn't know he was 7th in the class. Just one nitpicky point that I felt so superior noticing. But
like for all the things that we were like,
I'm like, it sure as shit wasn't me, but I know I know that nobody else would know.
Yeah, totally.
I guess wanted to bring up those 2 things and then ask you, did you know most people in your class? Because our class is quite a bit different.
Yeah, so Berkeley's one of the smaller law schools in terms of class size. I knew most people, but if someone were to say, oh, he was your class year or she was your class year, did you know them? And I didn't, that wouldn't even like register on my radar. There's another piece because people transfer in after the first year.
Yeah.
And those, for better or worse, I had plenty of friends that were transfers, but
same. That's really common at Harvard too.
There were some transfers I had no idea who they were because we didn't have classes together or didn't hang out socially. And so, not surprising. Similarly to you on the class rank thing, Berkeley doesn't technically have quote unquote grades. They have like they have distinctions, I guess you could call it, but because they didn't have technical grades, you couldn't do a standard class rank. I guess you could, but
yeah, they definitely could at Harvard, and they did, but it wasn't public.
It was not public. Yeah, ours was not public. Ironically, like one of the people I studied with my first year in law school, she ended up winning the prize for like the highest GPA. As knowing her, she had no idea that she was going to get that until like the day of graduation.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
It is tightly held. It's not like she saw the list.
Yeah, I feel like there are some grad programs where the students essentially vote on whether or not they want it to be public.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true for even law schools, but I think they're like MBA programs and stuff where they vote whether or not they want it to be public, and oftentimes people vote against it. I think it's typically the right call. It's like there's a
democracy and
loose,
competitiveness. That's what
totally,
it is. That's what it's creating a democracy around how competitive they want the program to be internally and externally. Right. Was there anything else like at Harvard? Was that actually filmed at Harvard? That's one question.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. It's some of the buildings look similar, but it didn't look like it was filmed at Harvard. Okay. So pro bono case. What stuck out to you here?
Pro bono does happen. At most corporate law firms, they're compensated based on hours billed to clients. Therefore, the partners and associates are tracking hours internally for how much time they spend on each client's matter or case or work product. And then in aggregate as an associate and as a partner, you're keeping track of that and that's kind of how you're judging how your year went, right? Are you hitting, let's call it around 2,000 hours, is kind of the standard for the amount of work you should be doing, which I think nets to just around 40 hours a week.
Yeah, I think we could do the math on it real quick, but I think it's like 40 hours a week. Well, yeah, it's 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year.
Yeah, so 2 weeks of vacation and 40 hours a week.
And to be clear, you're not billing every hour you're working. Far from it. You're, sometimes at big law firms, you'll be on a huge merger or a big case that's in litigation where you are billing to one client for basically the entire day.
Yep.
But most of the time you're shifting between matters and clients. And so to get an 8-hour day,
it's challenging. You're very busy. Would this subject matter be something that you would see in a pro bono case? I kind of think this is like a great contingency case. Yeah.
So this seems like a really strong, sexual assault or sexual harassment case. This would typically be handled by, an attorney on a contingency fee. So, a plaintiff's lawyer would take a case like this and
Mayberry Law would take a case like this.
yeah, somebody who has a lot of experience bringing these types of cases. This isn't something that would typically go to a big law firm to be handled by, a first year associate. So in terms of how the pro bono case in the show played out, what rung true to you?
Rung true.
Or maybe even, I've been saying it a little too much today, but what stood out to you?
Yeah, what stood out to me? I mean, I think the fun part of it was, well, one thing that really rang true to me was the associate was taking the lead and getting experience, doing a lot of the deposition prep, doing the prep for the trial and the case.
Which, by the way, is maybe not true for most of the corporate matters. This is one of the, I think this is something I was going to mention later, but might as well mention now, that did not ring true to me about the episode was how much responsibility Mike had on like day one.
Yes.
Pro bono can be a really great opportunity to have to play a more substantive role in the case. Even
to your point though, even on day one, it was probably extreme, but having the deposition in their, one of their offices and having like the actual physical look of the deposition kind of rang true to me, to be honest. The courtroom was a courtroom. So like a lot of the kind of pomp and circumstance around it was like pretty real. Substantively, we can get into that, but it had some holes.
Yeah.
How about you? What rang true to you and what?
Pretty much like most things are fair game in a deposition. You can object to the form of the question, but if it's not something that's totally out of line, it's going to come in. And then that doesn't mean it's going to come in at trial. Yeah. But they'll be able to cover it in the deposition. You could get some sort of protective order if there's particularly sensitive for whatever reason. One thing I wanted to touch on is there an element to interpersonal relationships being relevant in the law? Maybe more than they should be. Yeah. Sure. They were playing a little fast and loose with somebody threatening to have a prosecutor prosecute them based on relationship.
Agreed.
That'd be pretty clear prosecutorial misconduct. Yeah. You can't, the prosecutor's not your personal guard dog. They're representing the people of that community, no individual. The idea that a prosecutor wouldn't take blatant witness tampering seriously
felt a little hollow.
Felt a little hollow. That was massive fraud. Yeah. What they did, it's like they would be over a barrel in an almost like incomparable way. Yeah,
I mean the lawyer for the other side probably is very likely risking his entire career on that one fraudulent action if he was aware of it.
Entire career. Was there room for plausible deniability? Who knows? We don't know how this transaction was facilitated, but they are in deep shit. Yes. At that point, there are all kinds of strategic games. People do try and bury people in documents. They try and waste people's time by through misdirection,
through trying to avoid giving people
relevant documents. Yeah, they'll just
through legal means.
Yeah, and the mere fight over those documents, even if they ultimately get them, drains people of the time and resources. It can become the gamesmanship is absolutely real. Yes. Taking it to people hire private investigators all the time. That's very real. The idea that they would completely fabricate a witness, I'm sure it's happened plenty of times, but it's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's something that falls probably just shy of trying to bribe a judge. It's not. That's not a small thing.
Well, it completely erodes the trust of the legal system. And I would, for all the people may struggle with, people have very real gripes about how our legal system is enforced and how it works. But this is the kind of thing, it doesn't matter how powerful you are. If it comes out and if it becomes known, it tends to be something that like has real consequences. Yeah. No matter what.
Yeah. And that's maybe the best way to put it. There would be real consequences from that. All right. Last thing I wanted to cover was the heart-to-heart between Harvey and Mike.
Maybe talking about it in kind of the narrative arc that happens of their relationship.
They're progressively opening up to each other. They're
two like-minded souls.
They both seem like underdogs. We haven't gotten Harvey's full story, but we at least know started in the mailroom, through grit and cleverness, worked his way up. Him and Mike are similar in this way, progressively opening up to each other, becoming friends. there's clearly this mutual respect between the two.
They both tested the boundaries. They both
Yeah.
have a backup plan. Harvey sees a bit of himself in Mike in the interview.
And then we see Mike quitting. He leaves his ID card on the desk, walks out, presumably quitting. Harvey sees it, chases him down, and they have this heart to heart. One thing that rung true to me that I didn't have a ton of personal experience with, and I wanted to ask you about, was this idea of being pushed to that limit and like wanting to quit.
That's very real. Yeah.
I feel like I've talked to plenty of friends who've felt that way at different times, and plenty of people, want to pursue this as a career, and they net are really passionate about it and really committed. But
I mean, they go to 3 years of school and then burn out in 2 years of practice.
Yeah. This wanting to quit and burning out. And then Harvey references it later whenever Mike comes in the next morning.
Yeah.
It's like, I told Jessica I quit once a month whenever I'd started. But yeah, I guess, can you speak to the culture of, I guess, burnout and a bunch of really capable, self-driven, ambitious individuals who are ultimately out of the firm for a couple of years? Yeah.
So very real. I think it's a lot of perfectionists. I think it's a lot of ambitious people. I think law firms are full of people who survived, and maybe they did it with an ability to persevere through really challenging work environments, and maybe they want to impress those work environments upon the people below them, or almost like a fraternity or sorority where there's like, I went through the hazing, you're going through the hazing kind of mentality. It's very real to work really hard, go to law school, work really hard doing kind of what maybe isn't the most thought-provoking menial task, and the expectation being to be perfect. It can be a lot. Like, you're working 12, 14-hour days every day. You're dealing with people who are not nice whenever mistakes happen, and you're making mistakes. Ideally nothing that's causing any real consequences, but
and oftentimes it'll be caught by a senior associate or a partner.
But then they look at your work and they have edits, and then you think, oh man, I'm terrible at this because they have a bunch of edits. And that feeling of working that hard and feeling that much of a failure and saying like, oh, I'm doomed here. So the two things that are very real, one is the burnout from working that hard and feeling like a failure. The second thing is more senior people like Louis Litt telling you that one mistake and you're out of here is also a very real experience in these larger law firms. Not real, but it's a very real ideology that they pass on to more junior people.
Yeah, less of these like explicit threats, but there's this background pressure.
Yeah, and you think everyone around you is never messed up. They're so on top of everything.
Do you have any advice to somebody who might be interested in working at a big law firm for, on how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I would say is, one, come in realizing you're going to have to work really hard.
Yeah.
Those are table stakes. I think you don't have to be the smartest person in the world. You have to be smart, but you don't have to be the smartest. You have to have a ton of resiliency. You have to have good client interactions. And then on top of that, you have to realize that as a junior, your client oftentimes is the senior associate or partner. You have to manage so many personalities. It's a high EQ job. You have to have a base level IQ, but it's a high EQ job. And that knows no bounds.
Now, can you deliver it to me like I'm Mike and you're Harvey?
Yeah, exactly.
No bulleted points inspire me.
Yeah. I've worked harder than you have my entire career. Suck it up. Show up tomorrow. I'll see you then.
Perfect. Thank you. I think it's a nice segue into hitting characters. Do you have a favorite in episode 1?
Favorite character by far is Rachel. She is so likable, so realistic. She's one of my top 2 most realistic characters. As a paralegal who's helping out a junior. It's such an interesting dynamic to see someone who is so much more experienced, so much more knowledgeable than a first-year associate who's technically considered to be below the new maybe slightly arrogant first year associate. The smart associates are ones who realize very quickly that this person can be a shaman to the firm, like Mike does with Rachel.
Yeah.
One thing she noticed, she goes, "Oh, I'm not a really good test taker, so I never went to law school. I'm curious if she ever becomes a lawyer." Plenty of people at big law firms become paralegals for a couple of years and then go back to law school. She would have been on the later stage of that kind of standard trajectory, but
plenty of my friends in law school have been paralegals beforehand.
Yeah, and at large law firms. Right? Yeah. What about you? Like, was there a character that spoke to you? Were there other takes you had on the characters?
I mean, I think my favorite Harvey Donna combo.
Oh, okay.
Like as a character, because like couldn't help but be a sucker for Harvey just through all of the mild eye rolls. Like love to see him win, but then Donna was a really cool, like loyal character who, you know, her and Harvey seemed like a unit. Like they're
totally agree.
Like he would share anything with Donna. You can already tell right out of the gate. But then she'll call him on his shit. And so it's
and she'll cover his ass.
She'll cover his ass, but also call him on his shit. So it's like, there's this humanizing element that
totally agree.
That makes Harvey so much more likable, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Culture of law. One thing that really stood out to you as accurate.
The late night working between Rachel and Mike when they stayed up late and they ordered food. That is very real. I've done that more times than I could even count.
My time at a big law firm was as a summer associate, where you're essentially being like wined and dined. I would have been shocked if that didn't come up for you as your brother, having seen you grind for many years.
Yeah.
Like the general intensity of expectations and the hours demanded seemed
the hours demand, the general intensity, the expectations of performance, the working late, I mean, for me, coming in early and leaving late, New York, I did think it was kind of funny that they're like, in New York, the office opens at 7:30. New York, the office opens at 10:30.
Yeah.
For New York law firms. But
you might be there until 2, but
yes.
It's not that big of a deal if you're in at 10.
Yeah. The vibe of this is actually, in a lot of ways, quite real. How it played out in practice is different. Like the elitism of the law firm and the law and how people judge candidates, it is a prestige environment, and I think to some degree to its detriment. And I think, did they heighten those things for narrative and fictional reasons? Like 100%.
Yeah. And I mean, you kind of already hit on it, but what about the smartest guy in the room phenomenon? Guy or gal in the room?
Yeah. I think it is a ton of very, very smart people, and it's not realistic.
Yeah.
No one is the smartest person in the room. No one has like the capacity to outwit everyone at every given second, or at least if they exist, I have not met them.
Yeah. Also, at a certain point, become maybe insufferable. Yeah. At a certain point, very quickly.
Yeah.
I think so. Another thing I've heard you talk about a lot is, I mean, I feel like that's a big part of the reason why you love working where you work is there are a lot of people who are incredibly capable, smart, interesting people. They have a smaller desire to challenge people on being the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, they don't have to prove it. I actually think most of the time, the people that I found to be the most intelligent would not play dumb, but they would lay back and they would wait.
Yeah, they come in with
self-deprecating,
certain humility.
Tons of humility.
Okay, how about stuff that didn't resonate as accurate? Give me one or two things.
I'll maybe give you one, and it showed itself in two very salient ways, and we've already kind of talked about them. But they wanted to portray this idea of life's like poker, and they wanted to portray this idea of negotiating based on bluffing and leverage, but also bluffing. And in two scenarios, one, whenever they were discussing the bill with the client, and two, whenever they were, the other side had basically fraudulently created this employee, they used blatant lies and untruths or omissions, blatant lies and omissions to create this idea that they could create leverage in a legal environment with that tool or with that capacity. That is not realistic at all. How about you though? What kind of was most challenging to you?
Well, I don't know if I'd even say challenging, but something that didn't feel very realistic was Mike having so much responsibility day one. He's diving into all these cases, super substantive role. He's bouncing between, I don't know how much this came up, but it seemed like he was bouncing between litigation and corporate work, which some firms do split. I don't know how much you're doing both at the same time, but like maybe you spend 6 months in one group, 6 months in another group. And then the second thing was the number of aha moments. There were a couple of them, but whenever Harvey appreciated the fact that Louis Litt planted the fake employee, and then he had this aha moment that the person whose deposition was taken was a fake employee. There are like real idiosyncratic moments,
totally,
or like aha moments in the practice of law, but I mean, I can't get too mad at it. It's just like a great plot device. But
agreed.
I guess to put it differently, my experience with litigation is it's far messier, and of course that's like a harder story to tell and like less fun to watch. So agreed.
It's not as narratively interesting.
So the episode ends with them walking out. We've already mentioned it, but there's this direct reference to Batman and Robin. I'm excited to see more of that. Give me one prediction and one thing that you're excited to see in the next episode.
One prediction I have is that we're going to see the fact that, and we didn't really talk about this, but the fact that Mike, we don't know definitively. He said he took the bar. Is that right?
He said he took the bar and passed it, but I don't know if he took it as Mike or somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't know the story of like, is Mike barred in New York?
And I'm pretty sure it's a no.
Yes.
Is the answer.
Okay. So understanding how that plays out is like super fascinating. I think he's going to almost get caught and then somehow solve that one.
I've got to imagine that comes up a lot.
I feel like it's going to be a narrative point.
Well, and that's one thing that I saw whenever I was looking up the original writer of the show. And I don't know if he ended up writing the rest of the seasons, but anyways, the show's creator, part of the reason, I guess in the original version of the show, it was somebody working on Wall Street who had lied about going to Harvard, but the stakes were much lower because while that lie is a big deal, you don't potentially risk like your entire career in the same, well, maybe you do honestly, but
you may risk it, but it's a choice for the firm. It's not a choice for the governing body. Like whether or not it's possible.
And so the stakes are just heightened in a regulated industry like that. It's like you could have some like really serious criminal prosecution for something like that. Well,
and then all of the cases he's managed on the litigation side are somewhat questioned for forever. Like the liability is unbounded, and then for the firm itself, and for him, and then the to be honest, I don't even know what the implications are for cases that he ends up trying, and how that works.
I could speculate, but punchline is it's messy.
I'm curious and hopeful that Rachel goes back to law school and that maybe like a night school or something, so she can work
Stay on the show.
Stay on the show. Yeah. I don't want to leave.
In closing thoughts, like give me the one thing you're most excited to see unfold.
Most exciting thing is going to be how Mike learns the area of law, like that, because that's going to be us as the viewer understanding what law is, how the law firm works, how the legal system works, how he interacts with clients. Like all of those pieces are going to be developed through Mike coming from being a young Padawan lawyer at this firm. Again, question of Robin, to becoming a self-sufficient lawyer of his own. So I think that'll be an interesting narrative arc. But I'd be curious to hear what yours, like, what are you anticipating? Like maybe a couple predictions, and then also kind of what are you excited about? Yeah,
I mean, so I have the weight of going second here. We've hit some of them, but I think prediction, this feels like an incredibly easy one. We're going to get close to catching Mike as a, unlicensed lawyer a handful of times.
Yeah.
It's already come up in the first episode. I think that I'm curious to see if he actually gets caught at some point.
New York and California have laws around being lawyers where you can be a lawyer without going to law school.
Yeah, and so we don't know, I'm not intimately familiar with those programs, but essentially there's some real apprenticeship model,
real apprenticeship,
where you have to have another lawyer sign off on your experience, basically.
Like hours of work, almost like studying for...
Yeah, I don't know. I'm assuming that he's fully not a lawyer.
And so we think Harvey knows he's not a lawyer at all.
I think so. That's my understanding at this point.
Okay.
I
will be curious to know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm tempted to do some Googling right now. I'm going to hold back because we have a strict rule on one episode at a time, but I don't want to find any spoilers there.
I don't either. And I don't even want to know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I think context clues will happen. And I think it's ambiguous enough that they're leaving it open for us to figure out later.
Yeah. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. I'm also, I want to see some more drama between Lewis and Harvey.
Yeah.
I always find that fun, where it's like they're real stakes, but you know that neither of them is like, with Mike, sometimes I get a little nervous. It's like, you know, he can't get fired right now.
Yeah.
Or if he does, he's coming back, whatever. It's so heightened. It's always kind of fun to just see a Harvey go after Lewis.
Yeah.
And stand up for Mike. Yeah, so that's episode 1. That's our first episode of Suits on Suits. Looking forward to more to come. And looking forward to watching episode 2. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, if you like the podcast, come check us out. Like, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts. And we look forward to seeing you there. Please drop us some notes. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you want to see more of, less of. Come give us a little shit. Help us make the show better. Looking forward for doing this for a while. Yeah, you can leave that in the comments, and we'll put an email address in the show notes so that you can email us directly. See you next week.